Good morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you're listening to The Shift. I'm your host, Doug McKenty. This is episode 30 of The Shift. It's being recorded on March 14th, 2018. Just a reminder, if you like what you're listening to, please think about becoming a supporter of the show. That's on Patreon. Patreon.com/The Shift. If you want to catch my news feed, join us on Facebook at The Shift with Doug McKenty. Join the conversation on Twitter at DMcKenty and find out more about the show and catch my archives at www.theshiftnow.com. My guest on the program today is Jared Beck, Esquire, lead counsel representing supporters of Senator Bernie Sanders in a class action lawsuit alleging fraud against the Democratic National Committee for allegedly favoring Hillary Rodham Clinton during the 2016 presidential primary election campaign. Despite promises to Democratic Party members that the DNC would act impartially, Jared details in his recently published book, What Happened to Bernie Sanders, the variety of ways the DNC, in collusion with many mainstream media outlets, inappropriately and perhaps illegally influenced the election process by promoting Clinton to the extent that Sanders' success became virtually impossible. As a Sanders supporter and arbiter of a super PAC raising funds for the Sanders campaign, Jared became acutely aware that the DNC was not acting in accordance with its promised impartiality. The release of the now infamous May 26th memo, first by Guccifer 2.0, then WikiLeaks, revealed a treasure trove of emails from within the DNC that confirmed the suspicions of many by providing primary source evidence of a concerted effort within the Democratic Party apparatus to ensure a Clinton victory despite overwhelming support for Sanders' more progressive views by many party members. This prompted Jared to file a lawsuit against the DNC on behalf of the many Sanders supporters jilted by an unethical campaign process. In an attempt to seek justice, he found himself falling down a rabbit hole of intrigue, which includes 2 suspicious deaths of potential witnesses and almost complete media silence concerning the lawsuit. With us today to describe the process, exhibit the evidence, and update us on the status of the lawsuit is Jared Beck, Esquire. Thank you for being on the program, and thanks for helping to make the shift. How are you doing, Jared?
I'm hanging in there. Thanks for having me, Doug.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I imagine, like I described, you've been going down this crazy rabbit hole for the last couple of years, I guess. Why don't we just start by having you describe what your history is? I know you graduated from Harvard, and then you actually worked some pretty standard corporate jobs, even helping, I think, justify some of the banks in their robo-signing process for a little while before you got fed up and kind of started down this, what I could describe as a more progressive path. Do you want to talk about how that happened and what your practice looks like today?
Yeah, so I go into this a little bit in the book that just came out. But in a nutshell, I had a pretty, what I would call standard small town upbringing in upstate New York, just outside of the New York State capital of Albany. I was always did well in school. I was able to get, ironically enough, I got a scholarship to Harvard that was funded by the New York State Democratic Committee. I always had an interest in politics as a kid. I interned at the New York State Capitol when I was just in middle school. When I entered college at Harvard, I continued to study politics from more of a theoretical perspective. I thought at one point that I might go into academic teaching. But eventually, for a number of reasons, I decided to go the law school route instead because, quite honestly, academic political science in the United States really doesn't actually have a lot to do with the actual practice of politics in this country. And that was apparent to me even way back when I was in college. Mm-hmm. But going to law school, I thought it would be a way to sort of have a positive impact on society. There's an old adage that you can do practically anything with a law degree. Of course, coming out of law school, and I also stayed at Harvard for law school as well, I, like a lot of people who pursue higher education, they find themselves with a pretty sizable debt load after college or professional school. And that really dictates what options you have in life. I mean, I come from a wealthy family. My family was lower middle class. So you come out of law school over $100,000 in debt, then your options to pay that off are basically going to be in the corporate sector.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to do litigation, meaning I wanted to do trials and argue cases in court. So I ended up working for a couple years for large firms in Los Angeles and then in Miami, where I'm currently based, basically representing the interests of large corporations in court and seeing the American justice system from that vantage point and from that vantage point alone. But in the course of pursuing that line of work, I became involved in cases that suggested to me that this really wasn't the best use of my law degree in terms of making the world a better place. And I think you alluded to one of the cases I worked on, which was for a company that basically specializes in streamlining the foreclosure process and making it easier for banks to kick people out of their homes if they run into trouble on their mortgages. And I was doing a lot of that work in Florida in the 2005 time frame. And of course, there was a huge real estate crash that was about to happen. But at that point in time, there were already a lot of foreclosure cases going to the courts. And I was working for a company that was streamlining these cases. And my wife, Elizabeth, who I met in LA at the firm I had worked at before, we put our heads together and decided that, there are more important things than money in this world. I mean, you have to be satisfied with what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. I mean, that's just common sense. I mean, I think that's one of the things you have to do if you're going to find satisfaction in life. And so at that point in time, we decided to start our own firm. And this was back in 2005, or actually 2007. And we ended up representing real people that actually walked into our law office rather than, big companies who, aren't actual people, despite what our Supreme Court wants us all to believe. And it's a remarkably different experience. And it really shows you the real underside of the legal system when you make a career change like that. Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people, especially people that have graduated from the top law schools, I don't think they ever get a chance to experience what real American justice is about, because they end up taking these corporate jobs and becoming partners at those firms and really isolating themselves from the rest of society.
Yeah, interestingly, I think I had a similar experience to you. I mean, as a youngster, I was really into politics. I went to college and I studied philosophy, and I was studying all of this political philosophy. And as you're saying, that was a passion of mine, was to get into all of this theoretical these theoretical political concepts. And then I interned for Congress in Washington, D.C. in the early 90s. And the representative that I worked for was basically had lobbyists coming in all day. I showed up and I was expecting these grand debates on the House floor between the socialists and the libertarians talking about political philosophy, and it's like, right. In the real world, right. That is not what's going on. And I think there's a big part of this whole Bernie Sanders debacle that represents a loss of innocence for a lot of people. I mean, I think there is an awakening that is happening, especially among progressives that were really following the Sanders situation closely. That, hey, this quote unquote democracy is not really functioning the way that they taught us in school, Right. So you're, right. Right in the thick of opening up this can of worms. Really, I mean, it's almost it's a big karmic load that you've taken on for yourself. I really appreciate what you're doing, because I think it's so important that Americans do wake up, both on the left and the right, to the fact that this system really isn't I mean, it's a dysfunctional system. It really is. It pretends to be one thing on the surface, and then something else completely different is happening behind the scenes. You actually start out the book, you kind of caps the book with Plato's myth of the cave, which I think gets into this. Can you just describe why you did that a little bit? I think you were getting into this concept with that.
Yeah, so I think what you are describing and your experience having studied political philosophy and then gone to the actual practice of politics in this country and seen this contrast. I mean, to me, it indicates that there's a real political illiteracy in this country in terms of how people understand the way in which their government functions. And maybe the even more important question is what it means to be a good citizen of this country and how people understand that. And what is the message that we get in schools. And, I'm somebody that should be the most literate in politics, having gotten an undergraduate degree studying political theory from Harvard, a law degree. I also did 2 years toward a master's in political philosophy in the PhD program before I switched to law school. So that's a lot of teaching at supposedly a very high level about this political system. And yet I came out of Harvard, spending 9 years there, with really not even the foggiest clue about how political power is actually exercised in this country, which to me indicates, now having gone down the rabbit hole, having been a fervent Bernie Sanders supporter with my wife, and then, us having taken on this lawsuit on behalf of Bernie Sanders supporters that attempts to get at the truth of why he lost in 2016 in the Democratic primaries, because in my view, the evidence shows overwhelmingly that the system was rigged against him from the start. But having now had that experience, I realize just to the extent to which the education that we actually receive about the political system and our government is nothing more than the same kind of indoctrination that students in the Soviet Union would have been getting while the USSR was still in existence. And of course, you had, I'm sure, your average Soviet citizen had an understanding of their government that was really far out of line with the reality of how governance actually occurred in the Soviet Union. And so I don't think the situation is much different between our situation in the U.S. in 2018 and the situation of a citizen in the Soviet Union. The question is, what comes next? Because it seems to be an untenable situation.
Yeah, I think that's great that I've been making that same connection that most Americans, if there's any difference between, say, the Soviet system and the American system, I think the propaganda here is better. It's more people are more easily fooled. I mean, this notion that this is a great democratic nation. A lot of times, a lot of these foreign policy exploits that we're engaging in, we're doing in the name of spreading democracy, and people just believe it. They've been fed it 12 years of of public education. And even as you're talking about, if you go on to do university education, you're still basically fed the same line, when really it's like, what is this story? It's practically a mythology. And Americans are falling into this trap, and the reality is something that's completely different.
Right. And the mass media, and I think really, I think, we can probably talk for a while about this comparison between the USSR and the US. But something that we have that they didn't was this intense mass media, all immersive mass media ecosystem that exists here. And, not just on the TV now, but on social media as well, to the, given the extent to which, the mainstream media has really colonized social media. But it is very, it is an ecosystem. It is a technology. It is a network of power that is very, very practiced at inserting narratives into the mind of the American population. And they do that through not just the news media, but Hollywood movies and advertising, and you just name it. The population is drenched in it. And in many ways, it's been expertly brainwashed according to a select few narratives that are very, very difficult to shatter when you're trying to have discussions with people. At least I have in my experience. I mean, it's a very, very agonizing process to dialogue with people who are under the grips of these very, very intensely projected and perfected narratives that they've been inundated with.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've been getting into doing this show, being a part of the independent media. And the thing that I've started to notice is that the independent media consistently creates a totally different narrative than the corporate media. And the corporate media, unfortunately, does have an incredible amount of sway with the American public. And part of it, I think, is this notion that there's freedom of speech in this country, and that all of these, where I'm starting to realize, and I think you are as well, and I think the whole Bernie Sanders campaign is starting to open more people up to what's really going on behind the scenes, is that there's an incredible amount of collusion between these media outlets where people think, oh, you know, well, if CNN says it and Fox News says it and the New York Times is saying it, then it must be true because, you know, theoretically, they're all verifying the truth and they're all, you know, looking into it and they've all found these similar facts. It's just very difficult for the...
Not to mention they're wearing suits and they're in studios and they look very, very official. And, you know, I mean, these companies are experts at, you know, at turning assertions and opinions into facts in the minds of the average American consumer of media. And they do it very, very well. They did it throughout Bernie Sanders' campaign, and I give many examples of it in the book. But narratives are created out of whole cloth, and they're substituted for what should be happening, which is reporting, journalism. And to get that, you have to go to the independent media now. But there's really only I would say a small slice of this population that really understands that.
I've actually had conversations with people about the production value of independent media. You know, they'll say, oh, look at that website. It looks like crap. And CNN looks, you know, great and has this high production value. And it really sways people. And it takes a certain amount of discipline, which as a lawyer, you know, you've cultivated that kind of discipline, but to really find and search for the truth and be able to take all of those extraneous factors out and just start looking at the evidence and putting A to B to C together, it takes a discipline that you certainly don't find in the mainstream media. When you start to apply this kind of rigorous logic, you really do start to see that there's collusion going on in the creation of these narratives. And it was certainly able then to influence the Bernie Sanders campaign and versus Hillary Rodham Clinton. And you saw, as you saw, and you explained in the book, how the Democratic National Committee was able to tap into this and create this huge corporate narrative, and everybody just fell in line. So will you get into this, your personal story of how you, saw Sanders come out on the scene, you got involved, you developed this super PAC to try to help fund Bernie Sanders, and then the process that you went through of saying, hey, wait a minute, you know, something's up. Something's not adding up here. You know.
Yeah, no, so, you know, this was back in, I want to say late 2015 or early 2016, right about it, you know, the time that Sanders was really starting to actually get national attention, even though he had been getting huge rallies, huge numbers of people attending his events throughout the summer of 2015. There was still a national media blackout of anything relating to his campaign. I mean, if you look at stories from the time frame, even, you know, late 2015, mainstream sources are still not making even a distinction between Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley, you know,
right,
in terms of their stature as candidates. Elizabeth, my wife, and I got involved with Bernie Sanders because we had been at the time, and it really was Elizabeth who first really started to get into his platform and what his campaign was about, and talking to me about it. But at the time, we had been representing plaintiffs in the legal system for several years after having quit our corporate jobs. And when you represent, the little guy against the big corporation or the insurance company or what have you, you start to see just how unbalanced and unfair the legal system is to the little guy. And a lot of our cases actually came out of the mortgage crisis, the real estate crash, which of course all occurred on Obama's watch. And I was a lifelong Democrat. I voted for Obama twice. But as a lawyer representing people who were seeing their homes foreclosed on, who lost a lot of money in the real estate market when the bottom just fell out of it in 2008, along with the Great Recession. What shocked me at the time was to the extent to which Obama did absolutely no prosecutions of any of the bankers, any of the people responsible for this massive fraud that was perpetrated on the country through the mortgage lending.
Right.
And that's a chapter of recent American history, which people may not even really remember the details at this point anymore. But it was very fresh in my mind when we encountered Bernie Sanders. And here was a candidate that was actually willing to speak out and use the word oligarchy to describe how the economy in the country has developed. And that's the first time in my life. I mean, I'm 41, but I never experienced any candidate in American politics or who came close to that level of truth telling. And for me, I guess I had this, I had this real hope that I started to feel, and I know Elizabeth felt as well when we saw Bernie Sanders' message, and then we saw the response to it in society, because we've always been led to believe that Americans are a pretty apathetic bunch when it comes to politics, and it always comes down to a contest between a name brand Republican and a name brand Democrat. I mean, that's how let's face it, that's what American politics has devolved to.
Sure.
And here was a candidate that was legitimately getting such enthusiasm and visible enthusiasm that it seemed like this could be a real shift in the way this country governs itself. And so we got very excited about Bernie Sanders. At the time, one of course his big campaign platform was the awful effect on our politics that super PACs have had. The channel by which unlimited spending on our campaigns occurs. And so we thought, well, maybe we can form our own little super PAC for Bernie Sanders. We put a little of our savings in there. We started making videos, social media, low budget social media videos, countering some of the ridiculous narratives that were starting to come out in the mainstream media about Bernie Sanders, because when he finally got attention in the mainstream media, it was often couched in very negative terms. Oh, Bernie Sanders can't connect with African Americans. Bernie Sanders can't connect with Hispanics. Bernie Sanders, the people that like Bernie Sanders are quote unquote Bernie bros. Right. And we were networking with our fellow Berners in the South Florida area, and personal experience told us that everything about those narratives was a complete and utter lie. I mean, you couldn't imagine a more diverse group of people, not only across race and ethnicity and gender and age. I mean, supporting this man. I mean, you'd never seen such a diverse group, and then people who from Democratic backgrounds and Republican backgrounds. I mean, it was a real mix of people that were really energized by this guy's campaign. But I guess it all started to turn south when, first indication probably should have been the ridiculous way he was treated in the media and the blackouts that occurred and the false narratives that were created. But then when you started to really pay attention to what was going on. You started to see evidence of actual active infiltration of his campaign by the Democratic National Committee. And at one point, a gentleman by the name of Nico House, who was a very active Bernie volunteer in North Carolina, and had actually been featured in a New York Times article. He actually came into our law office in Miami with direct evidence that the DNC was infiltrating Bernie's campaign with Hillary Clinton loyalty lists.
Wow.
And that was a contributing factor to Bernie losing the South. And he had evidence with him. And, this was March of 2016. And it caused me to look at this. And because, as a lawyer, when somebody comes into your office with a potential case or a potential legal concern, you look at it very, very seriously. And, it started to really change my view on the whole process, I think, from that point forward.
Have you, because reading this and, actually experiencing it, it was funny to read your book and to go back over. I remember a lot of the things that you were reading in your book because, as the person that I am, I'm fervently doing research, and I was doing the same thing I'm sure you were, which was watching the media blackout happen. And just getting so frustrated by how it was going. But it was reminiscent to me of the Ron Paul campaign. And I don't know if you were aware, or did you think about the similarities between the way Ron Paul was treated and the way Bernie Sanders was treated? Because one of the things that I wanted to bring up in this conversation is that the things that we're talking about, whether you're conservative or liberal or libertarian or progressive or whatever you are, what the can of worms that this is opening up is a dysfunctional democracy. We all need to get together, because
to the extent that I totally agree with you. It's interesting that you mentioned Ron Paul because, look, what do they do in this country? They divide us into two teams, a red team and a blue team.
Right.
Okay. So, and a lot of, what team you end up being on actually depends on what part of the country you happen to be born in, maybe what your skin color happens to be, what your ethnicity happens to be, totally like random factors that you have no control over at birth. And you end up getting raised into this, one team or the other. And so, as a lifelong Democrat, I had never paid much attention to Ron Paul or what happened to him. It just wasn't, when you're a Giants fan, you don't pay attention to what's happening to the Patriots,
totally.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? You just know that you want to beat them in the Super Bowl.
Right.
That's pretty much it. But in the course of the lawsuit, actually, one of the pieces of evidence that came before us had to do with vote tampering at the machines and the use of algorithms to potentially, and nobody's really, I think, documented exactly how this potentially works. But if you look at the statistical analysis of the returns in certain counties, and one place this was really apparent was Debbie Wasserman Schultz was running in the primaries against a candidate, a progressive Bernie Sanders type candidate by the name of Tim Canova.
Right.
And we believe that the machines were tampered with to give Wasserman Schultz the victory, but the analysis of those results and the statistical anomalies, that the original work on all that came directly from Ron Paul supporters who had noticed the same anomalies when he was running in the Republican primaries. So it's like, the Democrats were using the Republican playbook that was used against Ron Paul. And it's fascinating, which suggests that, this is a much more ingrained problem in American elections. And it's not necessarily a Democratic problem, but a problem that, goes across the board.
Yeah, I mean, everybody really needs to wake up to this. I've actually seen the studies for some of the primaries with the Ron Paul election, and you can see where they're counting and tallying the votes, and then all of a sudden, Ron Paul's numbers start to slowly drop down, and Mitt Romney's numbers start to rise up in direct proportion to, and you're like, oh,
Right.
I mean, it's hard.
Right.
It's hard evidence that they were just vote swapping. And it's like, wow,
Right.
people got to wake up to what's going on.
Right.
I'm confident that the same thing happened to Bernie Sanders in places like Arizona.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, no. I mean, the evidence, a lot of good people have done exhaustive work putting together, evidence of machine tampering, and but it occurs at every level. It's not just the machine tampering, but it's also the ballot purging.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was massive ballot purging in Brooklyn. I mean, it's been, the facts have been found on that. The problem is that we don't have actually a system of election accountability in this country,
right?
Which most Western democracies actually do. I mean, they run their elections independently or under the aegis of some independent body that is able to ensure that the elections are run in a fair and partial manner. Whereas in this country, we leave that to the political parties themselves, and the two political parties, which have basically written the laws so that there is a duopoly and that you can't have a viable third party option in this country.
Yeah.
And, honestly, what do we expect? They're going to use their position to make sure that they remain in power.
Yeah, well, let's use this opportunity to segue then into, what is the Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee? These are private corporations. This starts to get into what was going on with the lawsuit, this issue of standing. You tried to bring in this notion that, hey, the DNC defrauded these Bernie Sanders supporters by pretending that they were this objective organization that was just running primaries, in their charter, in their according to their legal framework. They were supposed to be doing so impartially. Everyone believes that they're doing this impartially. But even the way the system is set up, I mean, this is what's so mind-blowing. The government, you're getting a government ballot, but you're actually voting for a private corporation, the private corporation that I think legally can choose their candidate however they want. I mean, they have these primaries, but they don't really have to follow, what the people actually say. The members don't have that much legal power behind these votes.
Right. It's a very strange system that's evolved. And I think if the founding fathers saw what this became, they would be horrified. Mm-hmm. Maybe not. I don't know. I just don't think that this is what they had in mind. They didn't refer to political parties anywhere in the Constitution. They were notoriously skeptical of political parties. Eventually political parties developed in this country. At one time in this country's history, in the 19th century, third parties played a very, very active role in elections. And so, you didn't have just this ridiculous binary choice that's supposed to make you feel like you live in a democracy. But, you could actually vote for other parties and they would have influence on elections through things like ballot fusion. But that's all been made illegal by the two parties working through, as legislators. And so really what you have now is, I think it's a riff on, like a one-party communist state. It's a little different,
right?
Because it purports to give you a choice, but it's like a choice between Coke and Pepsi. If that's all you had to, if that was your choice of what to drink, would you feel like you were exercising a free choice?
Right.
Any more than if you were just given an option of Coke? Not really. So it's a riff on that. Unfortunately, they've part of the genius behind the sort of the psychological brainwashing aspect of all of this, apart from the structural, is that you see this binary thinking among Americans in their political discourse, in our political discourse, that people just can't get pass between, get past this, red team, blue team mentality.
Yeah.
And it affects everything to the point where you can't have logic and reason, even in just your normal political discourse.
Well, and I think that this creating these two teams makes it so easy for the mainstream media to control this narrative. Like, they take an issue, whatever the issue is, they divide it up into these two parties. And then if you're on the blue team or if you're on the red team, they feed you what to think, and then you're fighting each other. And then there never seems to be any real, I mean, theoretically, there's supposed to be some kind of grand compromise, but actually, they're controlling the debate. So, I mean, there are some real solutions. I've done some interviews on this show with concepts like the community rights issue, if you're familiar with these guys, or public banking, that are real, real solutions that could be discussed, but will never be discussed in the mainstream media, right, because they're outside of that two-party narrative that you're discussing.
Well, what's tragic is that we have so many intelligent people in this country, so many great entrepreneurs, mm-hmm. so many creative people. I mean, America has no shortage of that. The problem is that, it's a country of 300 million people, and it's been subjected to an ongoing mass brainwashing campaign at a very, very high and intense level for many decades. And so enough of the population, look, these techniques don't work on everyone. I mean, these are sort of techniques that are meant to capture as many people as possible, sort of in the center, I guess, of, if you put people on some kind of, bell curve or something, mm-hmm. I guess. But that's all that's needed in order to control the population at a very stringent level. And, that's what the government is doing right now. So, it's hard to get excited, quite frankly, about ideas that are novel or, would probably work, in a wonderful way, or could really invigorate democratic life here, because, as you said, they'll never be implemented.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
Yeah, I mean, it's really easy to get apathetic. I think it's the reason why there were hundreds of thousands of people showing up to these Bernie Sanders rallies. I mean, it's like you're saying, like it is really easy to be apathetic, and we have this tendency to believe that Americans are just completely apathetic about politics, but it's because they feel so disempowered. And if you give them a shred of empowerment like Bernie Sanders did, they're coming out of the woodwork to try to make this happen. And it's just so disheartening to see that corporate system come down like a hammer,
Right, because, empowerment is a danger to the system. Yeah. It may be the only danger to the system is when people actually, get off their butts and, go out to a rally.
Sure.
But so they're looking to squat. I mean, at a very sort of, I guess high level view from inside the state, or whatever you want to say is governing us. Mm-hmm. They're looking to squash anything like that as soon as possible, or at least rechannel it into areas that may be less directed at the state itself and more directed at, each of us. So we're all in conflict with each other. And I think that's what's going on now.
Sure. So at what point did you then decide that things were so bad that this lawsuit was the direction to go in? I mean, we had with the release of all the emails, and people are looking at these emails, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, this was something I was thinking about preparing for this interview, was that, if they didn't do anything wrong, then why did Debbie Wasserman Schultz quit? She obviously, they all knew they got caught with their pants down, and she had to leave.
Right.
And then they tried to cover it up.
Why? I know. And that happened, during the convention itself.
Yeah.
And, in terms of your question, I mean, rarely in litigation, and I've been in litigation for over a decade, but rarely do you have the sheer quantity and quality of internal documents from the defendant just come into the public domain one day in a searchable database.
Right.
As happened with WikiLeaks. I mean, it's like, manna from heaven. I mean,
yeah.
It was an incredible thing that never happens in any case. And of course, we actually filed the case not on the basis of WikiLeaks, but Guccifer 2.0,
Okay.
which actually released the first set of DNC documents, and including a very, very damaging memo that I discuss in the book, which really laid out in black and white the entire media strategy that was going to be deployed to advance Hillary Clinton's nomination, even before Bernie Sanders had entered the race. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so you take that document and then you compare it to the actual legal documents that govern the DNC. Even though it is a private corporation, it's adopted a charter, it's adopted a set of bylaws like corporations are required to. And in those governing documents, it says that the DNC and its officers must be impartial and even-handed with respect to all the candidates. So here you have, a basic, it's a smoking gun piece of evidence, which shows that the DNC was being anything but fair and impartial to the candidates because it was mapping out the strategy by which Hillary Clinton was going to take the nomination even before Bernie Sanders had entered the race. And so at that point, I mean, as somebody that's litigated a lot of fraud cases, I felt that we had more than enough to allege a strong and plausible case for fraud and misrepresentation against the Democratic Party. And many, many people were contacting us at the same time, asking if they could take legal action because they were incensed. I mean, these are people that they had dug into their pockets and given what they could to Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Some, a few dollars, some the proverbial $27, others the maximum. I mean, we had lawyers and doctors calling us saying they'd spent paid $24,000 maximum donations to this campaign and felt defrauded.
Yeah.
Is there anything they could do?
Right.
And so, in terms of filing a lawsuit, I mean, it really was coming from both angles, the evidence and just the amount of people that wanted us or wanted some legal action to be taken on their behalf.
So when was the lawsuit filed? Was it as far back as June 2016?
June. Yeah, it was June 14, 2016.
Wow.
So even before the convention,
okay,
we got the lawsuit on file.
Interesting.
I actually went to Philadelphia with Elizabeth during the convention, and we were actually dealing with some of the legal issues that were already starting to crop up into the case as the convention was going on.
So I then wanted to touch on what is fascinating to me, because you ended up literally the person that served the papers to the DNC ends up mysteriously passing away a month later or 2 months later. And we also then have the case of Seth Rich, who may well be the person that released these emails in the first place, who also, dies in this mysterious way. I mean, you're going up against some pretty powerful people, and these, this is serious, right? I mean, can you just describe what that process must have been like for you guys?
This was the most difficult part of the book to write. Because of just reliving the feelings of dread and fear and confusion and real disorientation that happens when you realize that you just got a bunch of notifications on Facebook asking if your process server is dead.
Yeah.
And of course, this was, after we had live streamed Sean serving the DNC, and a lot of people, more people than I ever imagined, would tune into a live stream of somebody just serving some legal papers, tuned into that and really felt just even, I guess, the smallest sense of justice, at least possibly being served on the DNC when they were able to view with all hundreds of other people on the live stream, Sean Lucas delivering those papers. And of course, by now, I think the video on YouTube has well over 600,000 views.
Wow. And
then, to have this young man, wind up dead on his the bathroom floor of his girlfriend, and At the same time, the DNC had filed a motion to dismiss the case based on insufficient service of process. So he would have been a witness on that motion.
Right.
And we were in the process of trying to get a declaration from him to file in court when we heard the news. And so, you can't help but feel that that's not an accident when something like that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, and you feel and you feel targeted. That this is a direct message to the lawsuit. Like, this is what happens if you continue this. And we had a moment where the lawyers got together on a phone call and said, are we even going to keep going in this?
Yeah.
I mean, what the hell is going on here? I mean, and the Seth Rich's murder had happened a few weeks before, and there was murmurs and rumors in the press or on the media, alternative media and non-alternative media, about what Seth Rich may have been connected to. So, you put all this together, and it's a terrifying situation. I don't know if I've still gotten over it. I think we're still in the middle of it now.
Yeah.
The real question is, I guess there's a lot of questions that come out of this, but in terms of what that all means, I don't think the story's finished yet.
You got a phone call that you trace back to Debbie Wasserman Schultz's office as well. That was a threatening call, right?
Yeah, I mean, I write about this in the book as well, but we had all sorts of weird things happen in the course of the litigation. One of them being a call that was traced to her Aventura office, and when our secretary picked up the phone, here was a robotic voice asking strange questions about the case, and using one of these voice changers or what have you. Interestingly enough, the AWON, I don't know if you know about the AWON scandal in Congress, but there's the spy ring basically in Congress that's going totally unprosecuted.
Right.
These are people that Debbie Wasserman Schultz, among others, brought in. And one of them apparently had trained her in the use of voice changer technology.
Huh.
So now, the DNC came back and said, we think someone was spoofing her number, and, the matter is being referred to the Capitol Police. But, of course, nothing has happened as a result of that referral. But, here's a country where apparently crimes don't get solved anymore. We're not as citizens, we're not entitled to full investigations about what happened in Las Vegas, what just happened in the Parkland shooting. So I think all of this is kind of part of a larger picture that's going on. To be frank about it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is frustrating. It does seem, you touch on this as well, that this oligarchic class is above the law. This notion of the rule of law. Do we have a functioning government when it seems like these people can get away with anything? And you guys, much to your credit, were willing to stand up, to this apparatus, and you do find yourself literally physically threatened. I mean, that's amazing. It's really amazing to think about. These are the links that this oligarchy, they're willing to go to in order to protect their control.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I did a lot of thinking about oligarchy when I was writing the book, because I think one of the lessons perhaps that we should take away from 2016 is actually something that Bernie Sanders himself has stated very unequivocally, in fact, which is that the United States is an oligarchy. And not becoming an oligarchy, or in danger of becoming an oligarchy, or on the verge of becoming an oligarchy, or on the path to oligarchy.
Right.
No, it's actually an oligarchy.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's a difference. And, this is sort of me getting back to my, political philosophy days. But, a lot of the assumptions we make about our life as Americans or our identity as Americans comes from, I think, this bedrock assumption that's pounded into us that we live in a democratic society. And that affects everything we do. Well, we live in a democratic society. This is what it means to be a good citizen. You go to the polls, every couple years. You may vote. You read the newspaper. You turn on the TV after dinner. You watch a little either CNN or Fox and then you turn it off and you go to bed and you go to work. Or that's a good American citizen.
Yeah.
But that comes from that's only true if we're in a democracy. If you're in an oligarchy, you're in a different system. It's like totally different. I mean, in some ways, it's very mathematical. And Plato, getting back to the allegory of the cave and the Republic and how Plato thought about philosophy or politics was that he thought about things in a mathematical manner or not unconnected to mathematics, and really tried to get at the essence of what made a democracy different from an oligarchy, different from other types of regimes, and you can draw conclusions from that. And I think maybe we have to really face the fact that we are in an oligarchy, and that implies certain norms of behavior that we should consider that maybe we wouldn't have considered as citizens of a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole process, what everybody's been going through for the last 2 years, witnessing this, and it just came out right in our faces with what happened to Bernie Sanders, is this idea of the loss of innocence. And I absolutely agree that Americans, I mean, it's like you're talking about, it's such a part of our cultural identity that we're part of this democracy, and we watch the news and then we can go vote and our vote matters. And it's difficult to wake up and go, wait a minute, what a phenomenal waste of time, like what am I doing paying attention to all this stuff when my vote doesn't count? It does change the whole playing field. And I hope certainly that people are waking up to getting beyond this left-right paradigm, because until we've solved this problem, then, this is just a faux democracy, and we really are being fooled into participating into something that doesn't matter at all. It's just a form of population control.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, go
ahead.
No, I think when you really think about it, I think you put your finger on it. I mean, this is the primary problem. Policy at this point is secondary. I mean, you can argue until the cows come home about universal health care or gun rights or just go down the list of policies, foreign policy, but it's not going to make a difference what you think or what you say or how you vote. So, policy. So there really is no reason to be angry at people because they have different, policy preferences as you, because we're all equal in the sense that we all don't matter.
Right, totally.
So perhaps we should not be engaged in these, horrible, acerbic arguments, that are going to lead nowhere. And maybe we ought to, take the discourse in a different direction.
Well, I mean, one of the things that brings up for me then is this whole Russiagate scandal, because this is basically the excuse that the Democratic Party invented to, hey, let's look over here. It wasn't us. The Russians did it. And this has been dominating the national narrative now for, the last couple of years, really. And it's just getting worse and worse. And what it's done is it's taken this whole, what really happened to the Bernie Sanders campaign thing, and it is dividing us along this left-right paradigm. So Republicans are all like, oh, no, there was no collusion, and Democrats are all, I mean, the saddest thing about the whole thing to me is that so many centrist Democrats have actually started to agree with a lot of this neocon foreign policy. And, they're getting sucked into, people who you'd normally think of are maybe progressive and anti-war and, this kind of thing are now getting sucked into all this anti-Russia stuff as a result of this. And I mean, I've seen it. I get in these arguments too, and it's like a waste of time, but people are sucked into it. They believe the Russians are the big bad guys, and now nobody's talking about what actually happened to Bernie Sanders and what really went on in the Democratic National Committee.
Yeah, I would suggest that this whole Russia thing is really, in some ways it's the projection of the boogeyman within.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's really the result of Americans not being able to reconcile themselves with the really apparent fact, the evidence that there's something deeply wrong and fractured with American society right now. So we're projecting it on the most convenient enemy for these people to point to.
Sure.
The one that we used throughout the Cold War, which I thought was over, but
I know.
It can be resuscitated as needed.
Yeah, right. I kept waiting for them to like eliminate all the nuclear weapons. Now we don't need them anymore, right? The Cold War is over, and they just never did. What's going on?
Well, you see, it was they spoke too soon.
Yeah,
they realized that the end of the Cold War narrative created some serious problems because it how are you going to justify the American military machine if you don't have a war to fight?
Which this seems to me to be the ultimate feedback loop, is this $750 billion at a minimum that we're spending on the military industrial complex. I mean, this creates the oligarchy because they're the ones that are selling the guns and making all of this money off of it. And then they've, with all of this cash that they've got, they've been able to take over the government, and they need to perpetuate this permanent state of war to keep that cash cow coming in.
Relative to the population of the world, the oligarchs are basically just like a handful of people, all right, with an enormous outsized proportion of the world's resources at their command. And they need, in order to protect that from the billions of other people that are like, what the fuck, why do these people get all that? They need to have an army that protects them. I mean, that's what's going on.
Right.
It's really not much more complicated than that. Oligarchies aren't really that complicated. They're pretty straightforward. They're,
right.
A few guys run the show, and they can be either, actually, an oligarchy, if the few people running the show are actually, not maniacal people. I mean, at least according to Plato, an oligarchy could potentially be what he calls an aristocracy, and it could be a well-run regime. But when they're heartless, bloodthirsty, greedy beyond the belief people, like the oligarchs we have, then you have a very, very bad form of oligarchy, according to Plato. And it eventually, as he predicts, will decay into lawlessness. And I fear that that's where we're going.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I don't know what to do. I try to find solutions through this show and, interviewing different people to see what people can do. But it's very frustrating to wonder, what can we do at this point? Because the control is so profound. And I think, you're talking about this projection of the boogeyman within, this idea that the Americans are the good guys and that we're this democracy, as you described, is so big a part of the American identity. I think people just prefer to be in denial about it. It's challenging. You got to get everybody out of denial. Just like any addict or what. Get out of denial is the first step.
The real problem is that the people who are most invested in the system have the most incentive to be in denial.
Yeah.
So anybody who is paid by a corporation in some way, employed by a corporation. I mean, you're living in a society which, where healthcare is a real issue, unless you're, happen to be employed by a corporation that gives it to you. Okay.
Right.
So people aren't going to, jeopardize their family's health in order to take their head out of the sand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? They're going to keep the head in the sand. But those are the people who are the most critical if there's to be a change in consciousness, is people who actually can make changes from the inside. People who are already in government, people who are already on the inside of these corporations, which, whose interests are protected because that's how the oligarchs do their business. Okay, those are the people whose consciousness needs to be changed. I mean, when you're outside of the system, when you have your own business or your own independent platform, so to speak, I mean, it's much easier to get out of the denial mode.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to think about. People talk about how, and this is another thing that people have a hard time wrapping their minds around, not only the collusion between all of the different mainstream media outlets, like how can they all be running this same narrative when they're supposedly competing with each other in this free market, this free speech arena, but also the fact that how are all of these individual journalists and these individual politicians and all the people that are working within the system, like you're saying, how are they all involved in this grand conspiracy? And it's just like, no, it's like if you pay somebody $150,000 a year and you give them full health care package and,
exactly.
Their kids are going to a good college, they just don't want to think about it. They're just going to work and doing their job.
It's better just to say, those are just Alex Jones crazies out there.
Totally.
I've heard about them.
Yeah.
And I don't want to have anything to do with their ideas. Okay.
Right.
That is psychologically easier for them than to be like, hey, I'm involved in an evil process, but even forgetting the moral aspect to it, this process is leading us to some kind of cataclysm.
Yeah.
Okay. By any objective measure. Okay, if you look at history, when governments lose the trust of their populations at a certain level, it's not good. And when countries piss off enough other countries in the world, the results, they end up in a bad place for that country.
Yeah.
Across the board. And it's happened again and again and again and again throughout history. And that's my real, that's what sort of consumes me at night now. I mean, having gotten sort of, I guess, in terms of writing the book, I think I've gotten off my chest what I need to, at least for the moment, about the Bernie Sanders situation. But I think it's only a piece of a larger puzzle that's very, very, very disturbing. And I think it accounts for why Bernie Sanders himself has been such a loud voice saying the same thing for many, 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 many years. Okay. And what he was saying was, if we don't reverse course, we're headed someplace that's no good. And I fear we're getting pretty close to that place.
Well, we're looking at about an hour. I'd like to keep you for a few more minutes if you've got it, because I want to get back to the Bernie Sanders situation in specific when Donna Brazile came out with her book. I mean, wow. Like, I mean, not only does she admit that she's afraid that she's going to get targeted, and she is, concerned she's going to wind up like Seth Rich, which for a person who became, the chairwoman of the DNC, I mean, that's quite a statement to even give Seth Rich the time of day for these people. But then she also really outlined the extent to which the DNC, the finances of the DNC were controlled by the Hillary Clinton campaign, which to me is the clincher. You want to go into that?
Yeah, I mean, Donna Brazile, her book, talks about some things, and I think she skews the narrative to favor her own position as some kind of like, naive whistleblower on the collusion in the DNC when, let's not forget, it was Donna Brazile who actually passed along the debate questions to Hillary Clinton during that CNN debate against Bernie, and did it very unashamedly without seeing that there was any ethical, moral, or legal problem with her doing so as an officer of the DNC, and not to mention purportedly as some type of journalist associated with CNN, although I don't think you can use those two words in the same sentence any longer. So, that's, I think you have to keep all that in mind when reading her book. But I think the crazy thing about this is that here we have a book which actually does make some very damaging admissions against the DNC. and actually brings into the public consciousness a fact which I really flesh out or try to flesh out in my book, which is exactly how financially intertwined the Clinton campaign was with the DNC, such that the DNC was reduced to being nothing more than an arm of the Clinton campaign.
Yeah.
And but she brought, here Donna Brazil's book brought that into some mainstream consciousness, and still, to this day, we have no indication that the DNC wants to do anything to reform its ways. In fact, it looks like it's not even going to accept these minor changes to superdelegates that were proposed on this so-called Unity Commission. And so there's really no remorse. There's no sense that anyone is owed justice, or that the DNC is even going to ever even try to make things right, or even listen to what I think is probably the most essential component of its base that it basically stomped all over and broke its necks during the 2016 primaries. So it'll be interesting to see, I guess, how this strategy works out for them in the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you could touch too on the superdelegate system in general. That was definitely a big part of what was going on. You mentioned in the book, and I remember when this happened, when the AP article came out in early June before the convention and said, oh, well, we know that all the superdelegates are going for Hillary, so Hillary's already won, before even the election in California, which, of course, like one of the biggest states, if Sanders had won California, they just wrote it off. And then again, the mainstream narrative across the board was like, oh, Bernie's lost, it's over.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that example up, because that's a really neat and easily digestible example of how the media creates narratives out of whole cloth, using whatever bits and pieces of material they can find out there, and they package those narratives together in order to induce the brainwashed segment of the population to a certain result.
Yeah.
And so this is a great example, because superdelegates are candidates that have the ability, or electors that have the ability to vote for whoever they want. They're not bound by any duties relating to the votes of the actual members of the Democratic Party who vote in these primaries. But they basically, by the terms of the DNC's charter, they're not supposed to actually cast their vote until the convention itself. And yet here in June, I believe, as you mentioned, basically what you had was the DNC and the mainstream media got together very transparently, I think, and created a story in which the delegates had been polled and had therefore preemptively cast their vote, and therefore Hillary Clinton could now be declared the nominee on what they thought was a historically important date on the anniversary, 1 year, or the anniversary of when she had conceded to Obama or something like that.
Right.
Or a day before that. So I guess she could, claim that, she won quicker than Obama. That would be a useful thing for her. So they basically crafted the story that she was now declared the nominee because the superdelegates preemptively voted, which is nonsense. Actually, it's complete nonsense. That's not how the process even is supposed to work under the charter. But they don't need to, they omit any details like that, and they create, this is just, a prototype of, the same kind of BS they're always creating, like the Russia stuff. I mean, it's not based on evidence. It's not based on significant facts, but it's enough to fill out a narrative that tricks the brainwashed portion of the population.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that when you get inundated, I mean, it's interesting to think about the difference, say, between that kind of coverage and even the coverage that Donna Brazil's book gets or other things. I mean, every once in a while, the mainstream media will mention something like you said, they mentioned Seth Rich, but then it doesn't, if it doesn't conform to that narrative that the oligarchs, you know, or the people that are on top of this system want to project, then, you know, it's gone in a couple of days and nobody's talking about it. Whereas something like this Russia thing has just been going on for years. And they can spread the narrative that they want to spread far and wide. Like they cast this huge net and then they inundate you with this message until people just believe it because, you know, they can't believe that, again, there's some kind of grand conspiracy happening. And it's difficult. It is difficult to believe the kind of control they have over the mainstream media apparatus. And people are in denial. So they just don't want to believe it, even if they kind of know that it's true.
Yeah, well, you know, they've been doing this for quite some time, and you know, I think all of us have been susceptible to it. I know I was for a large part of my life, and you know, it took sort of a very direct and up close encounter with the power that is actually exercised in society by the oligarchs for me to, I guess, be shocked out of my mental complacency. But if that's what it takes, I don't know. It doesn't bode well for, you know, waking up other people, does it? I mean, and maybe it does. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of history that has to be written on this.
Yeah. When I have conversations with people now, I just urge that I talk about the corporate media as if I think because it's become more and more obvious to me, like if you're accepting advertising from corporations, then that's a conflict of interest and you shouldn't be paying attention to that kind of journalism because they can't tell you the truth when the truth goes against what their advertising wants. So and I just try to steer people towards the independent media as a more viable source and hope that they can stop paying attention to that corporate narrative.
Right. But then the question is so you get enough people, paying attention. First of all, what number is that? And if we ever get there to, like, assuming there's a critical mass where something happens at that stage, then the question is, okay, then what? What do these people do?
Right. Yeah, there needs to be some kind of organization, and it's not there yet. I mean, I don't know. You know, do you start a third party?
Well, we have now that's interesting. We already have third parties that have been in existence for quite some time.
Right.
And yet you would think that what just happened to, the Bernie Sanders movement in 2016 would be enough to generate enormous enthusiasm for a party like the Green Party. Okay. And yet, I haven't detected that.
Yeah. I have a vision, just in my own mind that somehow if we could get the Bernie Sanders supporters and the Ron Paul supporters to get together under one umbrella in some way, just to realize that we got to get past our differences in political philosophy and economic theory, at least for now, and take the government back from the oligarch class, and then we can worry about other stuff later.
Plato would suggest that, that you're right, that if you're going to reestablish a republic, which I think is what needs to happen, then you would need to have this general consciousness would need to have to occur whereby enough people were willing to, put aside their differences on policy and say, we're going to push for, what are they going to call for? They could, I guess the closest thing that our legal system provides or our political system provides is the possibility of a constitutional convention.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it makes it extraordinarily hard to actually call a constitutional convention.
Right.
Okay. It's like you've got to get a huge number of the state legislatures to call for one, and the state legislatures are completely dominated as Congress is dominated, and I think the other option is through Congress. So, it's not like you're going to be able to just declare a constitutional convention. So then the question is, what do these people do? Even if they put aside their differences, how do they break through this ironclad barrier that's been erected, by the oligarchy in the political system?
Yeah.
You know,
there was this. I did an interview with Cynthia McKinney and Robert David Steele. They had started this hashtag unrig concept that they were hoping to kind of unite the left and right. And their big push was election reform, just trying to, well, basically public funding of elections. I think as long as the lobbying is happening, I mean, it's just not, it's
I
not
don't
working.
see anything going through the legislative process.
Yeah.
Ever on anything like that.
Right.
So, the really, I guess, you can see the media as the problem because the media is propagating the propaganda that makes people, vote for these corrupt legislators over and over again through this, two-party system. So maybe the media is a problem, and how do we attack the media? Well, independent media, you get people off. So maybe that's a way it's done. The problem, though, that I see is that these, the oligarchs are very savvy. They've thought everything through, and they've basically, we have an independent media. They allow it to persist, but I think they overwhelm it with their own quote unquote independent media, or what purports to be independent media. So people may feel that by watching the Young Turks, they're engaging with independent media, when in fact the Young Turks is basically funded by a Hillary Clinton donor named Jeffrey Katzenberg, and it has nothing to do with independent media as practiced in the current media ecosystem. So that's a problem, and that problem gets worse and worse and worse over time, I fear, because the oligarchs inject more and more money into the media space.
Well, I happen to be with you. I mean, I think the same, it comes to mind, The Intercept is kind of the same way, where we've got this PayPal billionaire who's behind what's going on there, and they say some good stuff, but then, they're not really pulling the punches, or they're pulling their punches when it really hits the fan, and we really need to be getting that.
Glenn Greenwald apparently blocked me on Twitter because I was too mean to him.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah, that was too bad. And that actually, it turns out, I guess the owner of The Intercept ended up with all of those leaks, the Snowden leaks, and they ended up only releasing a small portion of them, and they're not letting the rest of them out, and we don't get the full story.
That's I think a classic situation where what purports to be independent or progressive or whatever you want to call it media is actually, call it controlled opposition. Maybe that's a little too trite, but it represents a point of view that's oligarchic in form, if not appearance.
Well, I hear you. Do you have any ideas as to where to go from here? I guess in conclusion, you could talk about what happened to the lawsuit. Actually, this would be good to talk about. You tried to go for this class action, you didn't get the standing in court, and now you're in appeal.
Right. So we're in the 11th Circuit. The lower court eventually dismissed the case, saying we don't have legal standing. And we are in the process of briefing the issues before the 11th Circuit, which may or may not hold a hearing on it. But it's already said that it has jurisdiction to entertain the case. So we'll see how that pans out. But that's really the legal process. I don't like to give my clients unfounded hope. And so I think it's important to remind everybody who's following the lawsuit that appeals only succeed 5 to 6% of the time in the federal system. So the chances are very long. And as they are with any lawsuit that gets to the appellate stage. But I believe we have good arguments. I believe we have important arguments. that go to the dysfunctional nature of the political system, and we'll be making those in court. And so people can follow along at JAMPAC, where we host the documents on the JAMPAC website, and we put up the documents as soon as we file them in court or receive them in court, so people can follow along in that lawsuit and inform themselves of its progress and the rulings as they're issued by the court.
And what is the argument that Bernie Sanders supporters don't have standing? I mean, it seems, from my vantage point, it seems pretty clear cut. Like you're talking about, you've got, is the DNC even obligated to follow their charter and follow these bylaws? Can they? I know in some nonprofit corporations, unfortunately, like this is the question I wanted to ask you, like who owns the DNC? Because actually in nonprofits, members of a nonprofit have a less legal standing, say, than somebody that owns stock in a corporation. Right. They're actually an owner, right, and they do have standing.
Right. Well, we've argued that we have standing in this case because our clients paid money based on a false understanding of the American political process. That, you know, when you look at the law, I mean, the payment of money based on false representation is never in question as maybe, and is even called the classic form of standing, Article 3.
Right, you'd think.
I mean, yeah. So really, what the DNC is doing in this argument is using the First Amendment as a shield. And what they're saying is if you allow lawsuits like this, you're interfering with the valuable First Amendment rights of political organizations such as ourselves. And those rights protect our ability to choose the candidates in any way we see fit, even if it involves, as the DNC's lawyer said in court, going into back rooms and smoking the cigars and picking the candidates.
Right. Oh.
And they've said that even if we admit that's how we do it, there's no legal recourse because the First Amendment protects us. Now, I think it's a really perverted and tortured argument because essentially it goes to the Bill of Rights and says that the Founding Fathers would have believed that the First Amendment, the right to free exercise, freedom of expression, the right to association would actually be a justification for allowing the country to be to have its politics entirely controlled by two private organizations that are mentioned nowhere in the Constitution,
right,
and can pick the candidates in any way they want and entirely control the system. I don't think the Founding Fathers would have been cool with that idea. Yeah. In fact, they were very skeptical of the concept of political parties to begin with. Okay, but on the other hand, so I think we have a very strong argument for why the DNC's arguments are bogus. Just to give a preview of what might happen in the 11th Circuit, and like I said, we're still in the briefing process. So, if there is a hearing, it'll be a ways off. But I just want to, say that Citizens United, and I talk about this a lot in this book, but Citizens United, which is the Supreme Court decision that basically opened the doors to unlimited spending in our campaigns by corporations, that was also decided under the First Amendment.
Right.
And the concept behind Citizens United and the lineage of cases on which it stands is that the First Amendment protects speech as the payment of money. And I think that's a pretty ridiculous concept as well. And I think that's a huge part of the responsibility for why we're in the political fix we're in lies with that very, very misguided and warped frame of warped line of reasoning was adopted by our Supreme Court.
Right. And the DNC then actually also, they argued that their promises, the quote unquote promises in their charter, were like political promises, and politicians, you know, they never fulfill their promises. So why do we have to? I mean, that is literally their arguments in court.
They made a lot of strange arguments.
Right. Yeah, a lot of, it sounds like justifications to me. Well, all right, Jared. I think it's probably about time to wrap it up. I think that's a great place to conclude. I hope people, you know, really are starting to wake up to what's going on. I do think, like, as we started with the allegory of the cave, I think people, a lot of progressives, especially Bernie Sanders supporters, are starting to walk out of the cave into the light now. You know, you can only beat your head against the wall so long, get treated this poorly before you start to realize what's actually happening. And a lot of it is thanks to your work. I'm really glad that you had, you know, the strength to pursue this to the end and actually bring this to a lawsuit, because it's super important. And I hope that your book does well. And I hope that more and more people do wake up to this. I mean, at least, like we discussed at the beginning, even if we don't know where this is going to lead us in the end, at the very least, the more people that start to, you know, get their heads out of the sand, you know, the more energy that we can drum up to start maybe doing something about this problem that's become so systemic. It is difficult to see our way out right now.
Well, you know, you know, that where there's a will, there's a way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I really hope that we, as a country, find a will to, you know, to do something.
Yeah.
What that is?
Right. Hopefully we'll find out. Do you want to let people know then maybe where they can get a copy of the book, or a website they can get on so they can find out more?
Yeah, if you Google what happened to Bernie Sanders, that'll lead you to the Skyhorse website, which is the publisher, and they have options there, including Amazon. But if you don't want to pay Amazon, there's also some others there, and there may be some independent booksellers that have it now. I know that you know, some people have mentioned to me that they were able to order it through their local independent bookseller.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, maybe you want to do that. I know there's a lot of people that, you know, the thought of paying money to Amazon disgusts them at this point
Sure.
in time. And I fully understand that. I mean, you know, you want to keep, like, you know, sending money to, like, the richest man in the world, who, you know,
yeah,
you know,
yeah, totally.
I mean, it's disgusting, and this, you know, seems to have happened overnight. It's been pushed on us, you know, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but that's, but you know, so anyway, that's, you know, hopefully, you know, my hope is that it's a book that people, even people who, you know, are firmly convinced by the mainstream narrative, maybe they were Hillary Clinton voters, you know, they'll take a look at this and read it and consider the evidence as presented. You know, I've tried to be very scrupulous in my footnoting of every citation to a factual element that can be checked, because I think we need to start getting into the habit of fact checking.
Yeah.
All of the claims that are presented to us, and not rely on rhetoric and images and presentation, but actually get in the habit of fact checking every claim, because the media is not fact checking every claim. They're manufacturing stuff. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to be intelligent consumers of the new media that comes out there, then we're going to need to be able to go back to, I guess, our sort of you know, book report type days, where it's just very fundamental that when you're writing an essay, you want to have factual support for every assertion. And so, you know, I kind of tried to give a template for this in the book by, you know, using a lot of footnotes. And I encourage people to go through the footnotes and go through the sources that are linked there as well, to the extent that they want to dive into any of the issues deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. I find again and again, the more of these interviews that I do, people that are waking up to what's really going on say it over and over again. Everybody needs to do their own research, and please be disciplined about it. And so I appreciate that you took the extra effort to source your material as well as you did. And I hope other people and the people listening are willing to go to the same links, because you can start to see through the mainstream narrative when you go through this effort, because they can't source their material as well as you did, because what they're saying is not true,
Right. No, I mean, you can, you can, I mean, when you encounter the Russian narrative, when you're having a debate with somebody over Russia, sit them down and come with facts, show them what, this so-called Russia, Putin stealing the election nonsense is really based on. I mean, it's nonsensical.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get the indictment online, okay? You can go through what the special counsel is supposedly saying, that is supposedly so critical to what happened in the elections, and you'll see that it's not based on anything.
Right. Well, on that note, do you mind if I send people to beckandlee.com if they want to get in touch with you? Is that good?
That's good.
Okay. And then I just want to remind people that if you're liking what you're hearing here, think about becoming a patron. I could definitely use the support. Patreon.com/The Shift. Join me on Facebook at The Shift with Doug McKenty. Join the conversation on Twitter at DMcKenty, and my website is www.theshiftnow.com. You can find out more information about the show there and find all my archives posted there. We're also on iTunes and YouTube and Podbean and a few other of your favorite podcast distribution sites. So I hope you enjoy the show, and thank you, Jared, for being on, and thanks again for all the work that you're doing. I know that you've even put yourself into some, personal danger, actually, kind of playing this game, with the big boys, as it were. And I definitely appreciate that you've had the strength that it takes to stand up to these guys, and writing the book and making these things more publicly known so people can break away from that corporate narrative and start to see through it and start to see the truth. Hopefully this is, more and more the beginning of something bigger, and we can figure out collectively what to do to stop the powers that be from having such control over the way we think and over our political system and over what's going on.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me, Doug. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate all your good questions.
For sure. Thanks, Jared. Have a good one.
Okay. You too. Thanks.
Okay.
Take care now.
Bye.